When steel, mathematics, and pure American overkill converge at sea, something horrifying happens. It's the kind of moment where an entire enemy doctrine, tested, trusted, worshipped, detonates in a single blast. And on a quiet stretch of the Pacific, that's exactly what occurred when American naval engineers armed the Iowa-class battleships with 16-inch armor-piercing shells the size of telephone poles, each weighing nearly 2,700 pounds. These weren't mere naval guns. They were industrial sledgehammers capable of traveling 23 miles, farther than some World War II aircraft could fly in combat range, and still hit with enough kinetic energy to tear battleship armor like wet cloth. Japanese destroyer captains believed speed, maneuverability, and night tactics kept them safe. They were wrong. They didn't just get hit, they ceased to exist. Radar locked them, fire control computers tracked them, and in seconds vessels moving at over 35 knots were reduced to twisted fragments spread across boiling water. No warning, no duel, just annihilation. Before we go any further into how those 2,700-pound shells turned Japanese destroyers into drifting metal confetti, I need something from you. Tell me where you're watching this from. Are you somewhere on the East Coast, maybe New York or Virginia, out in Texas, where naval history hits differently? Or are you watching from another country entirely, stunned by the scale of American naval firepower? Drop your city and state in the comments right now, because I want to see how far this story has traveled. And while you're down there, hit that like button if you feel even a fraction of the shock those Japanese sailors felt the moment Iowa's fire control radar locked onto their hulls. That single click tells the algorithm this isn't just another history video, it's a battlefield worth returning to. If you haven't subscribed yet, do that now. You're going to want to be here when we uncover what happened next, because the next part is where the Pacific turns red. The first thing most people misunderstand about naval gunfire is scale. They imagine cannons, explosions, noise. But what the Iowa carried on its decks wasn't artillery. It was physics weaponized. Each Mark 7 naval gun stretched 66 feet long, weighed over 120 tons, and required a turret structure the size of a 3-story building to house the machinery needed to control it. The projectiles it hurled into the horizon weren't shells in the traditional sense. They were 16-inch armor-piercing sledgehammers, 2,700 pounds of steel, tungsten and explosive charge that could punch through 18 inches of hardened armor before detonating. Fired at nearly 2,500 feet per second, each round hit its target with more kinetic energy than a speeding locomotive. This wasn't guesswork or luck. It was engineering so advanced that, at the time, it bordered on science fiction. The Iowa didn't need to see what it was shooting at. It didn't have to close distance like older battleships. It used radar, an electronic eye able to find, track, and compute firing solutions on targets hidden beyond the curvature of the Earth. Japanese naval officers had trained for decades believing gun duels occurred at visual range. They practiced night attacks, smoke screens, evasive maneuvers. None of that mattered when American fire control computers calculated trajectories with cold precision. To imagine being aboard a Japanese destroyer, something like a Kagero-class vessel, 388 feet long, armed with deadly Type 93 long lance torpedoes. These ships were built for aggressive night strikes and ambush tactics, capable of 35-plus knots, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy's doctrine. Their commanders believed speed was survival. They believed distance was safety. They believed their torpedoes were the ocean's deadliest weapon. Then the Iowa entered the Pacific. Without warning, radar aboard the battleship locked onto a formation of destroyers moving at flank speed. To the Japanese, no American ship should have seen them, let alone aimed at them. Yet, deep inside Iowa's armored brain, analog computers, gears, cams, and gyros humming like a mechanical oracle, spat out firing data. No hesitation, no second chances. The order was given. 3 Mark 7 barrels elevated, breeches slammed shut. Powder bags weighing 660 pounds per shot were rammed inside. Flames ignited, and pressure built to nearly 20 tons per square inch. A thunderclap tore across the water. The ocean lifted. The horizon shook. The first shells screamed through the atmosphere at Mach 2. Moments later, miles away, far beyond visual sightlines, a Japanese destroyer erupted. Not from a hit to its hull, from a penetration so violent that molten fragments blasted out the opposite side before the delayed fuse ignited inside the ship's machinery spaces. Bulkheads vaporized. Deck plates peeled upward like tin foil. Sailors didn't see a shell. They saw their ship come apart around them. And here's the brutal truth. The Japanese never even fired back. They were destroyed before they understood the engagement had begun. Their doctrine assumed battles occurred at 10,000 yards. The Iowa killed them at more than double that distance. Japanese lookouts, trained to detect enemy silhouettes, were facing a threat that killed from behind the horizon. As radios filled with screams and false bearings, another salvo left the Iowa. Water columns hundreds of feet high marked where destroyers used to be. It wasn't a battle. It wasn't even a duel. It was a demonstration. A single ship had just invalidated years of Japanese naval theory. For the first time in the Pacific War, an entire class of enemy vessel realized something terrifying. Torpedoes meant nothing if you died before launching them. Speed meant nothing if the shell outran your intentions. Courage meant nothing against a weapon that erased you without warning. The Pacific had a new executioner, and its reach was 23 miles long. What came next wasn't improvisation. It was refinement. The Iowa's crew didn't simply fire and hope for results. Every blast was part of a calculated sequence, a symphony of mathematics, metallurgy, and muscle memory. Deep inside the armored citadel, sailors operated the Mark 8 fire control computer, a mechanical brain weighing over 3,000 pounds. It processed wind speed, air density, ship roll, barrel temperature, target velocity, and even the rotation of the Earth. While enemy ships scrambled for bearings, this machine calmly predicted where they would be minutes into the future. The Japanese weren't just outgunned. They were outthought. Destroyers that once prowled the Pacific with predatory confidence suddenly became prey. Their captains had heard rumors. American guns with impossible range, shells that punched through armor like it was wax. But rumors don't make doctrine. Doctrine collapses when steel hits bone. The moment those AP shells landed, the Pacific's deadliest torpedo hunters became drifting carcasses of shredded steel. One destroyer attempted a desperate escape, pushing its engines to nearly 36 knots. Boilers screamed, turbines strained, and sailors clung to any illusion of safety. But Iowa didn't need to chase. At 23 miles, the battleship might as well have been firing from another world. Another salvo roared skyward. Spotters didn't see the shell. They only saw the result. A white flash followed by a rising tower of fire and steel. The destroyer's bow lifted as if pulled by an invisible hand, then snapped in half. Fuel tanks ignited. A blast wave rolled across the water, scattering flaming debris across the night-black waves. Japanese officers tried coordinating counterattacks, but their radios became morgues of panic. Reports contradicted each other. Bearings shifted. Ships vanished mid-sentence. No one understood how they were dying. Some claimed aircraft were overhead. Others insisted submarines were lurking nearby. No one believed a single battleship could erase them from beyond visibility. Inside Iowa, the mood was clinical. No cheering, no adrenaline theatrics, just the relentless cadence of professionals doing what they were built to do. Powder handlers hauled 110-pound bags into hoists. Gunners adjusted elevation by fractions of degrees. Radar operators whispered distances like surgeons calling out instruments. Every movement had purpose. Every action had consequence. The Japanese destroyers, by comparison, were designed for a different kind of war. They excelled at night ambushes, long-range torpedo runs, and knife-fight engagements, where human intuition mattered. Against traditional battleships, they were hunters. Against the Iowa, they were statistics waiting to be solved. Their Type 93 torpedoes, once feared across the Pacific for their 20,000-yard reach and massive warheads, never got within lethal distance. The destroyers couldn't see Iowa. They couldn't track it. They couldn't comprehend it. When a vessel finally spotted the muzzle flash, just a brief orange bloom on the horizon, it was already too late. The flash was the past. The shell was the present. Death was the future. One survivor later described the sound not as thunder, but as a ripping sensation, like the air itself was being torn open. Another claimed the water trembled as if something beneath it had woken up. Whether exaggerations or trauma talking, the sentiment was real. The ocean had gained a predator no doctrine could cage, and with each destroyer that disappeared beneath the waves, a realization spread across the Imperial Japanese Navy. There was no answer for this, no tactic, no heroism, no miracle. Their fastest ships, their most daring commanders, their proudest designs were being turned into underwater scrap before they even sighted a target. This wasn't warfare. This was sentencing. By the time the third destroyer vanished beneath the surface, the Japanese command structure cracked. Officers who once preached invincibility now stared at radar screens that showed nothing, and yet ships were dying. Messages flooded the combat networks. Unknown weapon, unknown range, I cannot see attacker. The Imperial Navy, which had built its reputation on precision, discipline, and elite night fighting, was now blind, deaf, and hunted. The Pacific, once their arena, had become their grave. The Iowa wasn't relying on chance. It was leveraging a weapons system that fused analog computation with industrial violence. Each AP projectile contained a hardened steel cap and a delayed action fuse timed to explode inside the enemy ship, not on impact. That meant destruction wasn't visible immediately. A shell pierced the hull, burrowed through bulkheads, ripped along machinery lines, then detonated deep inside where fuel, oxygen, and ammunition lived together like a bomb waiting for permission. When permission arrived, the result wasn't an explosion, it was obliteration. In one documented engagement, a Japanese destroyer attempted to zigzag while dropping smoke. It didn't matter. The Iowa tracked the evasive pattern automatically. The fire control system didn't panic. It didn't flinch. It simply recalculated. The battleship fired once more. The shell entered just above the waterline, punched through engineering spaces, and detonated near the ship's torpedo reserve. The blast tore the vessel in half. Survivors described seeing the destroyer's stern rise vertically before plunging backward, like a beast, dragged underwater by something far below. At long range, even nature helped the Americans. The curvature of the earth masked Iowa's position. Japanese spotters saw only water and darkness. They fired star shells into empty air, convinced enemy aircraft were overhead. Some crews even launched torpedoes at phantom shadows, believing submarines circled them. The truth was worse. The enemy wasn't a shadow. It was a fortress firing from distances once considered impossible, and Iowa hadn't even shown its full power. Each turret could fire a full broadside every 30 seconds. 3 turrets, 9 barrels, 24 tons of steel leaving the ship with each salvo. It was like watching a factory throw skyscrapers across the ocean. Meanwhile, the Japanese destroyers, designed for quick strikes, carried no armor worth mentioning. Their hull plating measured mere millimeters in some sections, relying on speed and surprise. But speed is irrelevant when death outruns you. Surprise loses meaning when radar sees your heat signature before you see the horizon. The Imperial Navy had built doctrines around the Type 93 torpedo, believing it to be the war's true kingmaker. They weren't entirely wrong. The Long Lance was a masterpiece, 610mm diameter, fueled by compressed oxygen, capable of ranges over 40,000 yards. But that technology assumed one thing: the destroyer must survive long enough to launch. Against Iowa, that assumption died first. Radios picked up the last transmission from one Japanese captain: shells from the sky, ship breakings, impossible range. Then silence. Not static, silence. The destroyer was gone, sucked into the cold mathematics of American ordnance. Afterward, analysts debated how it happened so quickly. Was it the radar, the shells, the training? The truth is simpler. It was the United States Navy understanding that war isn't won by matching an enemy's doctrine. It's won by making that doctrine irrelevant. Japan had prepared for gunfights. America built a god that fired them from the stratosphere. With every destroyer that disappeared, something far more valuable than steel sank. Belief. Belief in tactics. Belief in superiority. Belief in survival. The ocean had changed rules without warning, and the Japanese were playing a game that no longer existed. By now, word had spread through the fleet like a contagion. Something was killing destroyers from beyond the horizon. That alone shattered nerves, but what terrified officers even more was the realization that no one had seen the attacker. Japanese naval doctrine was built around human perception, eyes on target, instincts guiding maneuvers, commanders reading the ocean like a language. But the Iowa didn't speak that language. It communicated in equations, and it struck like a force of nature uninterested in negotiations. Inside Japanese wardrooms, men who once scoffed at American heavy ships now whispered about a battleship that could kill without being seen. Rumors mutated into superstition. Some officers believed the Americans had developed a weapon that altered gravity. Others insisted they were firing rockets disguised as shells. Commanders pored over charts, searching for islands, reefs, or hidden bases that could explain the impossible, a ship killing from distances previously thought unreachable. Nothing on those maps helped. Meanwhile, on the Iowa, routines felt almost mundane. These sailors weren't experiencing glory. They were executing procedures. The ship didn't roar with emotion. It hummed with inevitability. The Mark 7 guns were already cooling between salvos. Powder teams replenished charges. Fire control operators fed data into mechanical calculators that clattered like metallic heartbeats. Every click, every cog, every turn was part of a choreography designed to do one thing: erase whatever existed on the other end of the guns. When another destroyer appeared on radar, moving erratically, zigzagging at maximum throttle, it triggered no debate. The solution was automatic. Turrets rotated, elevation adjusted. A breeze shifted across the deck as the barrels aligned with the target. 30 seconds later, 9 shells were airborne. To the Japanese sailors, the attack started with a sound they couldn't identify. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't wind. It was something deeper, something felt more than heard. A low-frequency rumble that crawled across the water, rattling teeth and loosening screws. Seconds later, the horizon flared. A white-hot burst tore upward, as if the ocean itself had been stabbed. One shell struck near the bow. Another detonated amidships. A third penetrated the aft compartments before erupting inside the magazine. The ship convulsed. Deck plates split open, ejecting twisted fragments into the sky. Men bolted toward lifeboats only to watch them disintegrate under shockwaves. Some survivors swore the ocean turned white, as if boiling beneath them. A destroyer that once symbolized Japanese aggression now looked like a rusted scarecrow melting into the sea. The psychological collapse was complete. Japanese officers began issuing orders that contradicted their own doctrine. Avoid engagement, stay out of range, disperse formations. But how do you evade something that sees you before you exist on its horizon? How do you outrun a weapon that kills from twice your striking distance? The Imperial Navy didn't just lose ships, it lost identity. Even the Long Lance torpedo, once the terror of the Pacific, became a joke. Its 40,000-yard range, so impressive on paper, meant nothing when the ship carrying it evaporated before reaching launch parameters. Japanese sailors had been taught that torpedoes leveled the battlefield. Against Iowa, they were souvenirs of a fantasy war that no longer applied. Reports reached Tokyo. Admirals demanded explanations. They received silence, fragments, and a single chilling phrase. The Americans created a weapon that makes distance meaningless. Distance. The one element everyone believed war depended on. Gone. In that moment, Japan wasn't facing a battleship. It was facing a revelation. The old rules of naval combat were dead, and the United States Navy had written new ones in steel, smoke, and the infinite reach of a 16-inch gun. Shockwaves rippled far beyond the sinking ships. Naval attachés, strategists, and battlefield analysts from across the Pacific now faced a truth so brutal it challenged the foundation of Japanese warfare. Range was no longer a number. Range was a weapon, and the Iowa wielded it like a scythe. For decades, naval doctrine preached proximity, closing the distance, launching torpedoes, overwhelming the enemy with aggressive maneuver. The Japanese had perfected this doctrine with the Long Lance, a 24-inch monster of compressed oxygen that outranged every torpedo on Earth. On paper, it was unbeatable. In reality, It was a museum piece the moment Iowa entered combat. What good is a weapon whose launch platform vanishes before it even detects a threat? This was the trap Japan never saw coming. They engineered weapons for the war they expected. America engineered weapons for the war that didn't exist yet. And nothing exemplified that more than the 16-inch 50 caliber Mark VII gun system. These weren't simply artillery pieces, they were industrial miracles. Each shell weighed as much as a Harley-Davidson motorcycle. Each projectile moved at 2,500 feet per second, twice the speed of sound, and carried enough kinetic energy to punch through 20 inches of hardened steel before detonating. At 23 miles, that meant a weapon on the edge of the horizon could hit with the precision of a sniper. Every shot was a message carved into the Pacific. Whatever you build, we can reach. On board the Iowa, this wasn't chaos, it was math. Sailors didn't shout guesses, they executed algorithms. Radar beams swept across the ocean like invisible spears, locating ships before binoculars could even find silhouettes. Analog computers, fat metal brains filled with gears, solved ballistic equations that once took hours in mere seconds. This wasn't naval combat. It was industrialized annihilation. Japanese spotters stared through optics designed to track aircraft and saw nothing. No flashes, no signatures, no muzzle blast, just a sudden roar of death materializing out of nowhere. Their commanders reacted like men trapped inside a collapsing ideology. They tried new formations, altered radio call signs, scattered destroyers across the map. None of it mattered. You cannot outmaneuver arithmetic. When American naval gunnery evolved from eyesight to equations, the battlefield transcended human reaction. Japan was still fighting a war of instincts. The United States was fighting a war of computation. Survivors from the destroyers spoke of seconds that felt like betrayal. One moment the ship was cruising confidently. The next, bulkheads buckled, ladders twisted, steel bent like ribbon candy, and men vanished into instant vapor. There were no warnings, no exchanges, no duels, just eradication. Some sailors believed they were fighting ghosts, others believed they had angered a god. But the truth was far colder. American engineering had merged metallurgy, chemistry, radar physics, and fire control computation into a single entity, a weapon system that turned the Iowa into something the Japanese language had no word for. Not a battleship, not a fortress, something between machine and inevitability. A destroyer commander once wrote in his final log before disappearing beneath the waves, "We cannot see them, we cannot touch them. They kill us from a distance we were never taught to fear." That diary never reached Tokyo. The Pacific Ocean swallowed the ship, and the ship swallowed the doctrine that once defined an empire. Here lies the breaking point of the war. Japan didn't lose because its sailors fought poorly. They lost because the enemy had already arrived in a future they refused to imagine. A future where metal did the thinking, radar did the seeing, and a 2,700-pound projectile delivered judgment from beyond the horizon. There are battles where men fight men. Then there are battles where one side fights mathematics. Japan fought both and lost. In the end, the Pacific did not remember speeches, doctrines, or boasts. It remembered steel. It remembered the thunder of guns that could carve history into the ocean itself. And it remembered the men, ordinary Americans, who operated the greatest naval weapons ever put to sea. Those sailors never asked for statues. They never demanded glory. They stood inside steel corridors hotter than furnaces, loading shells heavier than their own bodies, trusting a machine that turned their sweat into the most feared judgment in wartime history. They were machinists, fire control operators, radar technicians, loaders, powdermen, and gunners, each one a link in a chain that stretched from the factories of Pennsylvania to the waves of Okinawa. Their ships, the Iowa-class battleships, were not instruments of destruction. They were instruments of inevitability. They proved that in war, courage is not enough. Will is not enough. You need engineering, precision, and a belief that the impossible can be built. To every designer who forged the Mark VII gun, to every sailor who stood behind it, and to every piece of American steel that faced the Pacific and refused to blink, your legacy did not sink. It echoes. It roars. It still hits at 23 miles.